Are you right?
You can start.
Yeah, cool. All right. Most of you know me already. My name is Matt, and today I'm going to be talking to you about kinship. When I chose this subject, I actually intended on talking about religion, but I decided that religion is something that I study all the time, so I went with something that I don't study instead. So forgive me if it's not the greatest, but we're going to give it a go. So first and foremost, I want to discuss the fact that kinship itself is an idiom. It's a terminology that we use to put together an idea that we have. It's a social construction. This fits in with what most people see from a postmodern kind of view of things, but anthropologists see it this way as well. It's a social construction, a selective interpretation of the common human experiences, and these include mating, birth, and nurturance. All of these issues are universal across all human societies. If they didn't exist, then humans would not exist. And so it's something that we've put together in order to codify this so that everybody understands what everyone's talking about. Kinship can be the formation of societies, but it can also be an underpinning part of societies. So it does depend a lot on the size of the communities and the societies that you're talking about. So if we're talking about small societies, quite often you'll find kinship is a lot tighter and a lot more integral to the function of the society than we do talk about larger societies. So if we compare it, say, with a small Aboriginal mob, or even a large Aboriginal mob according to their sizes, kinship plays a much higher role in their society than it does in, say, modern Australia. And I use the term modern as in a chronological thing, not any political reasons behind that, but a modern Australia, kinship is no longer as important to the function of society. However, it is still an underpinning part of society. We all have kinship relationships. No matter how small our families are, or how small our communities are, or how large they are, there is kinship happening within those communities. And it exists in small communities and then also within larger communities. An example of a larger community is, of course, our own community in Australia. We find kinship in different situations no matter where we are. So even at university, you will find that we may have different backgrounds, we may have different religious beliefs, we may have different ages, we may have different skin colours, we may have different cultures, and those defining factors are often used to form small kinship groups, which may not have the strict rules that other kinship groups have, but they do form those groups. So entering university, I'm at this unusual age where I am technically a mature age student, but I'm young enough to get along with most of the younger students. So I bounce between the two groups in university, depending on who I'm talking to and who's sitting in the smoking area. These things are small micro kinship groups because we then associate with one another and form relationships. They will have unspoken and spoken rules depending on which group you're talking to. So it depends who is relating to who. And in these situations, those rules are typically unspoken. People are often just ostracized in order to exercise those rules. There's no formal forms of punishment for breaking those norms and those rules. The primary functions of kinship are, as far as I could tell and from the readings, it's reproduction, which is marriage or adoption. I'll get into these in more detail in a second. Where people live, which is your residence rules. Intergenerational links, which can be through descent, biological descent, or adoption, or a mix of both. And then succession and inheritance, which is power and property. Which is what most sociologists would concentrate on. So we're going to delve a little bit into these because we've only got 10 minutes, so we want to make sure this is nice and quick. From the reproduction standpoint, we're looking at societal norms and rules that are established to restrict and formalise reproduction. Marriage is tied to reproduction because of childbirth. Adoption is also a practice of reproduction, though it's not biological, and kinship is not always tied to biology, especially with societies that accept mixed families and with an increase of medical advances. So what I'm getting at here is that societal norms are things that we all agree, whether it's written down or not written down, are the normal practices within society. And these are malleable, they change over time. We've studied all through this anthropology course, we've been studying the fact that norms are not normal at all, they're societal influences that we all agree upon. or disagree, and then we change them. These societal norms in kinship groups are usually used to restrict and formalize reproduction. So for a prime example, which they discussed in the lecture and discussed it in the videos as well, incest, not okay. According to the vast majority of cultures, incest is not okay according to our norms. There are biological reasons and evolutionary reasons why we have a disgust reaction to the idea of incest. There is some evidence to show that it is biological as well as societal, but society definitely plays a major role in that because you have some cultures that are okay with certain levels of incest. This, from a biological and evolutionary standpoint, is a very good thing for us to have because babies produced through incest don't have enough heterozygosity, which means that you end up with misformed children sometimes. Not every time, but sometimes. And that means you end up with adaptations that shouldn't be there, what we would call mutations today. Marriage is tied to reproduction for a number of reasons, depending on the culture that you're looking at. The marriage system, whether it's a legal, like a state-governed situation like we have in Australia, a religious, such as the Catholic Church or the Christian Church or the Jewish Church, those churches make decisions for marriages and have rules around marriages. And then in some cultures, there's just marriage ceremonies. So that, again, this was discussed in the lecture and discussed in the reading, where two young people go into a house, spend the night together, walk out, sit on the front porch, and then they're married, if people accept that marriage. These rules are established for a number of reasons. One of them is biology. The other one is because marriage is often tied to things like succession and inheritance. So it's important to have these rules in place. Adoption is another form of reproduction, though it's not tied to biology. And adoption, depending on the culture you're looking at, may be just as valid as a biological child. So an adopted child may be viewed as just as valid, or they may not be. It depends on the culture. And that changes over time as well. As I said, all of these are malleable. Because in Europe, during historical times that you all know I'm very well aware of, adoption was not technically a way you could inherit in certain cultures, but now adoption is a perfectly legal way to inherit from your family, in the same cultures just 500 years apart. And the same as we've got American native populations that take adoption separate to their succession and separate to their inheritance, but it makes you part of the kin. So you have a lot of cases, especially during the time that America was being colonized, of white people or Europeans running away from the lifestyle that they were living as colonists, joining the native people, the native populations, and not wanting to come back because they were adopted in as kin, and the life was much better for the natives than it was for the Europeans, apparently. So yeah, kinship is not always tied to biology. There is a perfect example in myself. I have a very, very large family. My family, my parents, my father had children from 3 different women, so I have lots of half-siblings. Then my mother remarried into a family where there were 7 children already, and then we added our 3 brothers into that situation. So my kinship group is insanely large. And then there's my brothers who are not at all related to me, but I fight with them, and we've shed blood together, and I've broken their bones, they've broken my bones, and we've all looked after and cared for one another. They are also my brothers in my mind. So a lot of this is, again, malleable and changes based on your community. And that's even within the community you're all used to. So that story may seem unusual to some of you and may seem normal to some of you, and we're all from the same, relatively the same society. So it is dependent on the kinship group. The next thing that we discuss is where people live. This is often dictated as part of marriage and adoption norms. So a perfect example, you live with your parents until you marry your partner, then you move into a house together. That was the standard practice for thousands of years in European culture. Today, we don't do that, but some of us still experience ostracizing if we do break from those rules. And so these rules are established, whether spoken, unspoken, whether written or unwritten. These rules are there for various reasons. It allows kin groups to establish physical locations and is tied to descent and succession, which we'll be talking about in a moment, and inheritance. There is important reasons, but we'll talk about that in a second. Social norms constructed out of established rules for the group. Again, these are social norms, which means they're malleable. They're made up by society. It's a social construction. And so none of these rules are technically universal. Marriage is fairly universal, but the laws and the rules surrounding marriage and how it's portrayed across different cultures is not at all universal. There's some universality between different European cultures and some universality between different Middle Eastern cultures and some in Asian cultures, but if you compare those three predominant cultures to one another, there is vastly different rules. And a lot of those rules aren't written down. They could be religious based, or they could just be something that's always happened, so we treat it as normal. It's a normal thing. There is also the social norms that we have that are established because of other taboos we have. So I mentioned the incest taboo. Unfortunately, I don't have an example from my family for that one. But brother and sister sharing a room post-puberty is not normal in this society. This is not a normal thing to do. It's seen as unusual. You can see this because of TV shows and things like that that portray it as unusual. So you've got shows like Malcolm in the Middle, and I can't remember, there's one where they're all taking drugs and terrible lives. Anyway, it's set in England, and an older brother and sister live in the same room together. Everyone thinks it's weird. So if we're seeing it as weird in our culture, or what's happened, if we're seeing it as weird there, then it means that that's seen as a social norm. There's reasons for that. Again, incest is not a good thing in most cultures. Intergenerational links. You've got descendancy or adoption. So I've already explained that. You can descend biologically from your partners, or you can be adopted into that kin group. In some cultures, adoption is just as valid as biology. In other cultures, it's not. Now, adoption here can mean a couple of things. It could mean, the legal adoption. You take a child and adopt them into your family. You can adopt adults in as well, but it also could mean marriage. It depends on how you're reading the different cultural books. So when you're looking at adoption, it doesn't necessarily mean, sign he performs with the government. Marriage and reproduction create lineage in a majority of cultures, and lineage groups depend on that culture. So I've said this a million times, it depends on the culture. Marriage and reproduction is the number one way cross-culturally that you decide who comes from who. So if we're tracing a line back, whether it's matrilineal or patrilineal, you can trace that line back to decide where you come from. So if we take Scottish clans as an example, because Scottish clans are probably the most famous and well-known in European culture, Scottish clans don't necessarily know exactly where they are traced back from. My father-in-law is part of a Scottish clan, and so he can wear that patronage, he can wear the badge, he can wear the tartan, he can do all those things. When he used to fight me, he would fight wearing the MacLean badge and the MacLean heraldry so that he could fight against me because I was English and he wanted to hurt me. The clan groups there are lots of kin groups that live within, typically when we're talking back in the past, but even now, geographically they live in a similar area, and that allows them ownership of that area. It gives them control of that area, and that's important because when you have a clan leader, when they're fighting the English, for example, who is killed, you need to know who's going to take the next succession. And that wasn't always passed down directly to the son. It could go to a cousin or an uncle or any of those male people, not female, because the Scots didn't have female inheritance. Also, it means that across the world, you can find kinship with people you've never met before. So if you've ever attempted to do a family tree and you started searching your ancestry like myself, I've done, I discovered that I have a huge amount of family living in a town called Beer in England. So if you go to Beer...
I've had a beer in Beer.
Sorry?
I've had a beer in Beer.
Yeah, well, I've never been to Beer, but I intend to. But as my father explained, you go to Beer, you ask for fish and chips at the local fish and chips shop, they ask for your name, you say Bartlett, and they say which one. Because there's so many families in that area that have that last name, and we can trace our lineage through DNA back to join one another together, which means if ever I end up in beer, I have an immediately established kinship group that I can find, hopefully, fingers crossed, that I can find someone to live with for free. But that means we have that kinship there and we've never met one another. So with the advancement of technology, kinship has changed significantly. And the other one with intergenerational links is that if we have a patrilineal family inheritance structure, which is what the vast majority of Europe was based on for a very long time, was that patrilineal, oh God, that's a terrible word, succession and inheritance. It means that you need to trace your father's line. But today, in vitro artificial insemination, means that you can't always trace your father's line. In fact, there are lots of women now that have children and they don't even know who the father is, which is a disruption to that idea of succession and a disruption to that idea of inheritance. Luckily, we live in a culture that's quite malleable with those ideas, so it doesn't matter, and women have fairly equal rights to men now when it comes to inheritance in our culture, and so it's not as big a deal. But that was a big problem throughout many, many different cultures. Even today, that's a big problem in cultures where the understanding of who the father is under question. And that leads us straight into succession and inheritance. So, as I said, inheritance can be patrilineal, matrilineal, bilineal, or a mixture of all of those. In Australia, it's typically, and I say typically as a generalisation, a mixture of both. So bilineal and the other two, depending on where you're from. And it's influenced by the historic norms, the religious norms, and the changing societal values, and it could be argued it's more important in smaller societies. So when you have smaller societies with smaller amounts of goods, it's quite often more important to understand the sharing of those goods. Doesn't necessarily mean the direct inheritance of all of those goods, but your right to access those goods or your right to access those lands. A perfect example of that is in the current debate surrounding the Australian Aboriginals and their applications for land rights, trying to get land